Great. Thank you so much for having me here this evening to talk. It's great to continue these discussions of music and anthropology, not only with Chris in the seminar that he was mentioning, but also the fact that Jerome Lewis has presented on the topic of music and anthropology as well. So I kind of hope this can kind of add to that as a sort of sub-theme within some of the things going on within the radical anthropology group. Just to kind of give you a bit of a background to myself, I'm currently at the moment a postdoctoral scholar at UCL Anthropology working on aspects of the Mongolian economy as part of a kind of postdoctoral research project. But my PhD research was on this topic here, so you're kind of seeing my doctoral fieldwork, which was taken over a long period of time in Western Mongolia. But you might see some kind of hints of some kind of similar themes that cross over, and I'll point it out as I go to kind of show that when we're talking about music in Mongolia, there are so many different avenues and different connections that can be made between different kinds of historical, factors, political ones, the way that Mongolians constitute forms of different types of ethnicity within Mongolia, and how this is actually implicated now, especially, is it all right? That's okay.
Stop causing trouble.
This isn't meant to be about noise and stuff, so it's fine, yeah. It's fine. So the way that different types of cultural delineations about Mongolian culture post-1990, so in the post-socialist era, because Mongolia was a communist country for 70 years, roughly 70 years, and in this kind of post-socialist period, there's been a rediscovery or a kind of awakening and flourishing of different kinds of cultural practices linked to religious and shamanic practices that had been suppressed in various ways during the communist period. And so these kinds of redelineations of Mongolian, what constitutes Mongolianness, have implications for how Mongolia also asserts itself as a separate sovereign nation between Russia and China as well. So just to kind of put that out there, I'll kind of come to that at the end of the talk today to kind of, link these up. And this is where the question of value comes in. Because what I'll be doing today is explaining the different types of significances that musical practice has within Mongolia by focusing and drawing from ethnography that I conducted in a rural district in West Mongolia. So I'll explain a little bit more. This will kind of become clear as I go. The main thing I'm going to be hinging around my talk today is the role of performance. And when I talk about performance, this is kind of like looking at the ways that different people work together to create different kinds of ceremonial contexts and types of musical performances on stage. The topic that I'm going to be talking to today implicates both different spheres of social life in the district that I worked in. Some of it is linked to practices that are spiritually quite powerful and sort of connected to different kinds of deities that live in the landscape. But then also other types of songs which can be popular songs that have been known throughout Mongolia as kind of a type of what they call bogundu or short songs, are also part of these kinds of musical lives that I'm going to be talking about. And when we're talking about musical practice in this area, there's not a very clear delineation between secular and sacred, although there is in some ways, but the ways that different types of performative actions and the roles that they have kind of really complexify this divide between the two, because performance itself, singing a song, different kinds of performative speech acts, declarations of blessings and well-wishing benediction kind of performative utterances are seen to be very efficacious and having some kind of implication in a future space ahead of time. So, on that note, so when I'm talking also about musical practice, I'm not just talking necessarily about song genres, and I think that's one of the clear things that the anthropology of music can bring into the discussion, where you can look at the different ways that different types of social life is created through musical action. And so when I talk about musical lives, I'm not just talking about song genres, I'm not just talking about necessarily kind of formal performances. We're talking about a variety of different types of things. It can be singing in a long car ride. It can be performing on a concert stage. It can be musical knowledge and having certain types of custodians that know a large amount of music and know about genres. These people might be part of lineages of people that have gone back several generations that have the knowledge of these particular more sacred song genres, but they might not necessarily be performers themselves. But this kind of musical knowledge play a really important role in the kind of musical and social life of the area that I work in. One kind of thing I want to go into, I've sort of already hinted at it in my sort of opening introduction, but the way that I've looked at it personally in my work has been a way that's kind of contextualised within the anthropological studies of music more generally. But I've been trying to kind of look at the crossover and the melding between musical practice and social life. And so what I've actually been talking, I borrowed a term from the ethnomusicologist or anthropologist called Fiona McGowan, who's done some fantastic ethnographies of Yolngu people in northeast Arnhem Land in Australia. And she describes it as a form of musical sociality. And this is a kind of way to say that through musical action, types of social understandings, relationships, shared concepts, evocations of a good future to come are all brought into being through the act of singing itself. And so there's not a clear divide between a social action and a musical one. And this will become clearer once I show you some examples. So to kind of give you a bit of a guide for how I'll be structuring what I'm going to be talking about today. So this is emphasis on performance practice and how this intersects with musical knowledge. And this also crosses over into larger preferred forms of social behaviour and how this kind of then someone can be described as being, say, a really good person. For instance, when I was in the area that I did my work in, for someone to describe someone as a sand urchin or like a really good singer, often this would be someone who was of exemplary moral character as well and other facets within the area that we were living in. And so to be a good singer had kind of like people were demonstrating their commitment to other kinds of ceremonial roles, the presentation of self, the connections with different types of people. And these kinds of moral classifications came into being through the act of singing themselves, and then people getting a reputation for becoming someone who was known as a good singer. And often it was a way that people did kind of build bridges that sometimes had been created between different types of familial groups or different kinds of groups of people that were working together or not working together. And so it had a kind of like a positive effect. And I'll explain a bit more about the implications of this positive potential within musical practice, because wherever there's a positive potential, there's also the potential for someone to create discord or anger or frustration through perhaps not performing correctly. And so there is a kind of like a balancing act between these negative and positive polarizations. And then I want to kind of show how much these kinds of performative acts and music in general in this area are linked to the reputation of the people that I worked with on a national scale. So just kind of going back to this slide, partly because I really like it. It's by some of my really, really good friends from the area. But I think it's kind of always nice when hearing these kinds of descriptions to see people that I'm going to be talking about. The way I came to do work in this area was because I had, previous to my PhD, had worked for a year at the Arts Council of Mongolia as a heritage program coordinator. And because my background was in music and in anthropology, I was kind of drawn to different types of musicians that were coming in and working within the Arts Council. And I met some people that had been from this particular area in West Mongolia. And what I was struck by was how much these types of practices from West Mongolia, and I'll explain in a minute how this kind of sits in relation to national Mongolian spaces, but they'd developed a really strong reputation for being custodians of older types of traditional practices. And some of this had been linked up to the listings of these practices on UNESCO as forms of examples of Mongolian intangible cultural heritage. And so I was really curious, firstly, partly because there was also this kind of like a corresponding discourse around these practices perhaps not continuing on as much as people would like, this discourse of, say, practices dying out or perhaps not being practiced so much in the same older ways. And I kind of wanted to kind of look at that from a critical point of view and say, well, how do people themselves who actually have this knowledge and practice it every day, how do they deal with these kinds of national discourses of fame and these expectations, or quite a fair bit of pressure on them to perform in certain ways and to be the carriers of something that was so emblematically Mongolian? And so in doing so, when I went there and started working in this rural area, it completely diversified into all different other kinds of spheres of life. So it wasn't necessarily just about heritage practice, although that was an important part of it. There were also lots of social imperatives in the area that I worked in where people felt were really required to do certain things musically. So to do this, to kind of talk about these themes today, I really want to kind of present this from a Dort-centric perspective, and Dort is the place that I worked in. And I want to kind of show you very much how people situate themselves within Mongolia and who are the people that I'm talking about in particular. So this is a map of Mongolia. The capital, Ulaanbaatar, is in the sort of north-central area of the country, and this is very much a kind of key economic and political centre point. It's also the centre of national governance. It's where a lot of people have moved from the countryside, either temporarily on and off or permanently, to access different types of education and health. And so it has a kind of gravitas in some ways as being this kind of epicentre of Mongolia. It's also the largest urban space in the country. And then throughout the rest of the country, each province has a provincial centre, which is a kind of smaller urban space. And then each area within that is divided into rural districts. So it's quite a kind of centralised governance system, which is a hallmark of the socialist period. This kind of similar system of governance is there, although of course it's changed, and democratised and things like that. But there is the way that these kinds of administrative units are taken care of is still part of this kind of vestige of that period. So I did work in Hovd, and Hovd is part of Western Mongolia. I don't know if I can move too far away with this, which consists of these four, so Golvaltai, Zavkhan, Uvs, Bayanotki, and Hovd. And so this area is known as like Baromongklin, or West Mongolia. And it's known to be a place that has been more ethnically diverse than other areas of Mongolia. Now, when I say ethnicities, I'm kind of talking about, like, it's an interesting term, using the term ethnicity in Mongolia, because technically everyone is Mongolian, but there are sub-ethnic groups within the country as well. And the dominant one is Halkh. And within West Mongolia, it's a very a diverse area, which actually speaks to, I'll explain this in a minute, sorry, I'm just jumping around a little bit. It speaks to the fact that Hovd itself and West Mongolia is also borders other areas within China and Russia as well that have a large amount of ethnic diversity as well. So the people that I work with are known as the Alta Oryanghai, and they live in Dort. And their kind of world as to when they live in these rural areas are very kind of connected, where Dort is sort of seen as some kind of like a Dort Alta Oryanghai sort of centre of itself, connected to different kinds of roads that branch out to Hovd city, which is a really important focal point. Also Ulaanbaatar, a lot of people go back and forth to Ulaanbaatar a lot. Doing field work in these kinds of rural areas, you would often find myself trying to, go and reach people and talk to people. And often when I would go and say, oh, hi, I said I was going to meet so-and-so today, they're like, oh, he's gone. I'm like, oh, so when's he coming back? Oh, 3 months' time. And this was a really common way of, the thing I had to work with. And so often I would, jump onto jeeps with my friends and go to Hovd, partly to do work with them, but also because they were moving, I wanted to move too. It's a very mobile place. So these rural areas are predominantly made up of mobile pastoralists, so herders that herd animals and move 3 to 4 times a year within the district to raise goats and sheep and cows and horses. But that type of mobility also extends to a kind of mobility between different kinds of centres as well. It's not necessarily something that's purely, as a result, purely herding based. It's also a kind of larger mobility between these areas. And Urianghai and Dort have a lot of connections with Urianghai and Bai and Olgi over the border of the district there, and also into Xinjiang and China as well. There Urianghai there too. And so there's a kind of, where Xinjiang is also seen as a kind of place where really older and quite, we say, I'll use the word Jinchen in Mongolian, which means authentic. And this, of course, is a term that, you know, is utilised in a variety of ways, but they see people coming, the Urianghai from Xinjiang being very authentically Urianghai, and it's kind of seen as a cultural epicentre of its own as well. So this kind of starts to show a different kind of perception of what a centre can be, and, you know, what a periphery can be. So when I was working in Hovd and working in Dort and working in Hovd City as well, it was very much seen as a kind of major centre point of West Mongolia. Where Hovd City itself is where a lot of different ethnicities have come to, say, go to the university, go, you know, access the hospital, and so you would often find different types of people that are from the different areas. And I, as part of my PhD research, when I was, you know, getting to know people on a day-to-day basis, you know, starting my ethnography, I was doing kind of household surveys as a way to try and gauge, you know, get to know people and gauge, you know, where people were from, and I kind of collated a bunch of information as to where people had been, who had been born in this area, had moved to, and there was a fair amount of movement, or kind of like a diaspora, I suppose, of its, if, for want of a better word, within West Mongolia itself, within other rural districts too. So yes, this was a billboard that is in Hovd City, and it says the many nationalities native homeland, and so it's kind of like this part of like a political promotion of the fact that this is a diverse place of different kinds of Yastin, and Yastin are the word for ethnicity in this area. This is where I did most of my fieldwork. So this is the Dort Sumtov, we're like the centre of the district, a centre of the rural district. So you kind of, again, seeing these, again, there's kind of other types of centres, but this is the main kind of centre point within the rural district where herders move out into the rangeland and move seasonally to access different kinds of winter and then summer pastures to herd their animals. And in the centre of this centre of the district, sorry, the word for district in this area is called Sum. There is a hospital and a school and a veterinary clinic, a kindergarten, and so that's where the district's children would be educated, and people would kind of move there. Either a lot of people lived there permanently, but then also herding families would live there seasonally. Sometimes when the autumn and winter months, the husband would be out herding the animals, and the wife would come in and set up a ger, a round felt collapsible dwelling used by the herders in this area, and so they could send their children to school.
How high are they?
How high?
Temperature, yeah. How high?
Oh, it's a good question. 2,200 metres, if I remember correctly. I did write it down. The exact, yeah, it's the highest district in Mongolia. It's actually, this is what makes it kind of distinctive. So it's set in, it's located in the Altai Mountains, and so hence the term Altai Urianghai, which is this particular type of ethnic group. Yeah.
Temperature?
Well, interestingly, because it is in an alpine environment, so this is the Bosog Valley, where the Sum Centre is situated. It's actually relatively protected by the mountains, and so it would get to like -30 during the day in winter, and that's not necessarily all that cold. Yes. Yeah, as in other areas of Mongolia, in the wide open steppe land, it can get to like -40 or more. So this is actually a relatively protected area that my friends would always call it Pluekhahn, like, which is, it's warm here. This is, but these things are all relative, and also it had a much more kind of alpine, varying form of temperature, where you would have like snow coming through. And which you don't necessarily get in the same way, that kind of alpine weather changes during the day that you wouldn't see in other parts of Mongolia. So when you're there, it's very much a kind of mountainous area, which you'll see features quite heavily in these kinds of songs and things that I'll be talking about. Interestingly, the name for Dort is actually the word dor, which is the word for sound. And dort with a T at the end of it is the dative locative suffix to say this is the place of sound. And this was a local historian from Hovd University described to me, who was from this area, that this particular lake is called Dort Nor, so Dort Lake, and it's named after the sound of the wind rushing through it, through the valley. And so these kinds of sonic references to the landscape, to the environment surrounding it, to these kinds of natural features, which are quite powerful in their own ways spiritually, means that the sound and kind of like the role of sound features really heavily in the way that people conceptualize the place that they live in. The word for dor, dor also translates to song. People didn't say that this was the place of song. They emphasized this as the place of sound. It's the place of the sound of these, the wind rushing through. So kind of giving you a bit more of a description of how people live in this area. This is of a herding encampment of a friend of friends and extended networks of people. And so this is an example of where someone would set up a ger for a number of months while they herd in the local pasture land before they move as the seasons change. And also, I'll quickly skip to here. And this is an example of someone living in the Sum centre, so where there's a ger set up for people to live within what we call what are called hasha. Hasha means technically the fence of land being enclosed by a fence. So it's kind of different types of land plots. But yeah, this is kind of the way that people are living in this particular area. And one thing I just want to emphasise how much living in this area requires constant cooperation between different types of familial groups, and this includes the assistance and help given to herders as different kinds of seasonal requirements with their animals, from milking goats at particular times of the year to combing goats for cashmere, as well as the collecting of dried animal dung to use as fuel in the Sum Centre. I went out on several trips to collect animal dung and collected huge vanfuls of it, which required going out to people's daughters and sons who were herding animals and then collecting it all. So these kinds of types of mutual cooperation were really, really important in kind of bringing everyone together to make things happen. And so you'll see this kind of extended into the musical areas that I'll be talking about. And also the supply of milk products, of milk, of dairy, and also meat for food as well, was all connected to families into the countryside and areas. And just to kind of point out that even people living in the Sum Centre, people working in the banks, working in the post office, working in the cultural centre, a lot of them grew up in herding families. A lot of them have their aunt, their sister or their brother doing work in the herding areas too. A lot of people have herding knowledge. It's hard to distinguish between a herder and a non-herder, or like a mobile herder and then a settled non-herder. Those kind of distinctions don't necessarily exist. And so you'll find that people will, do all different kinds of roles, and part of that is also knowing very well how to go out and help someone and be useful. Unlike myself, I don't know how useful I was sometimes when I was trying to help. It was a big learning curve for me. And being able to go out and help people do what they need to do. So, moving on to the musical aspect of everything. In the area that the district, there is a cultural centre, and this cultural centre was set up during the socialist period as a key part of gathering people together for different kinds of community events, as well as dissemination of propaganda, often through performance as well, through theatre and music and things like that. But the cultural centre now has a huge kind of role within the area, which I'll explain a little bit more in an example shortly. But what I kind of want to emphasise is that these kinds of socialist musical practices that were perhaps attempted to be secularised often existed alongside and within other kinds of musical experiences that people accumulate over a larger lifetime. And so I kind of want to give you a bit of a quote from my friend Sevagjov, who's pictured here, proudly displaying his medals to Hungarian researchers that were coming through to research with him. on his knowledge of Urianghai songs, and it kind of showed again this kind of prestige and fame that circulates and also is cultivated within the rural district as well. He described to me when I was asking him about the difference perhaps of socialist music practice versus post-1990 musical practice, and he kind of almost like not necessarily dismissed it, but he was a bit perplexed by my question, and instead he said, well, I've always been a cultural centre worker. I participate in all cultural events. I learned to sing long songs, which are called ortendol, from nairs or traditional celebrations when I was a child, and I followed the other wedding guests. Sorry, just to give you a bit of a background, Sevigjav was born around the earlier time of the communist period. I learnt this from following elder people and by singing with them. And so when he's saying that, he's talking about the kind of imitative way of learning songs by copying older people and practicing by performing, so practicing and learning through doing. And because I'm interested in songs since I was 10 years old, I started to follow people around who can sing and learned Urianghai satirical songs or shogdu from them. Folk songs, artendu, and short songs, bagundu, I learned mostly from books. And the artendu, which are called like a type of national or people's song, and short songs were one of the types of genres that were promoted during the communist period. So he's talking about how he learnt them from books during that time. I officially learned these songs and followed theatre and cultural centre workers, and I'm connected with arts and cultural activities until now. And so what he's saying here is that he's really kind of showing that this kind of continuum of communist musical practice to post-communist musical practice has been this kind of longer life trajectory of different kinds of musical experiences, rather than it necessarily being something of a separate or a juncture. Although that can be felt by some people, I think when I was working in this particular area, it became clear that the social networks had encouraged different kinds of retention of cultural knowledge during the socialist period, through different kinds of elderly people teaching people different ways that more spiritual genres had been secularised and put on the stage, but this kinds of spiritual knowledge had been kept on and being talked about. So it was something that was kind of foregrounded and backgrounded during this time as people negotiated the different requirements of the state. And during this period as well, the socialist government, in the way that it controlled different types of cultural activities, wasn't necessarily a kind of one-size-fits-all. There was different there were different relaxations and then more constrictions placed on cultural practice as different people took power at different stages. So I now want to talk about the role of singing in a life cycle event, and this really kind of brings into sharp relief the discussion that I was mentioning earlier about musical sociality. So a lot of the way that people move when they marry is that the wife moves to the place that the husband is from in this particular area. And so this was a nair, which is known as this type of celebration, and I'll show you a film excerpt soon so you'll see more of what I'm talking about. And what's happened here is that the groom's family has assembled on the western side of the ger, and is starting to sing and welcome in the bride as she arrives from the place that she's from. She was from Hovd city. And so as part of this kind of creation of space, of bringing people together, there is a real intent behind it to try and create something which is really, really welcoming, really, really going to kind of bode well for the future of this newly married couple. And so here we see this really interesting, efficacious role of singing come into play as well. And so what happens is that in the northern part of the ger, the Hoimur, you can see quite a few elderly people are sitting there, the most esteemed guests, and often the elderly relatives of the person who's getting married. And as you can see around the side of the ger, people are becoming younger in a sense that they're kind of like, there's a age ranking occurring here. And people coming into this space, according to the particular age that there are and the different types of responsibility they have in this particular ritual context, they're required to gift a song and give a song to kind of help create a form of celebration. And so what happens is that one person will initiate a song and then other people will start to kind of join in and kind of build up. And I'll play you a short example now, and then I'll show you a film excerpt where it kind of explains it a bit further. Can you all hear this? Yeah. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to, I might move it to this one, hang on. Okay, so there's an interesting soundscape being evoked here.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
question.
Mhm.
These standard songs, are they just made up as they...
Oh no, they're very important songs, these
They
ones.
are.
Yeah. So,
They're not made up songs, they're real songs.
yes, very
No, I
much.
mean, they're not,
Yeah.
what I'm saying is that they're not made up, they're not like...
Improvised in some way.
Improvised, yeah.
There's an interesting question that you're asking, and it's really relevant to the type of song that it is. It's an arrhythmic song, so it doesn't have a rhythm. It has a melody, and the way it kind of flows, so it's not improvised, but the rhythm itself is not necessarily kind of like a metric rhythm. So it's not like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 repetitive kind of beat to it. And so when this particular song is called a long song, and it's partly this long kind of, it's long type of song. It's like a long drawn out melody. It's kind of stretched, if you think about a melody kind of being open and stretched without any kind of meter to it. And this particular song is really about, as a kind of, the song genre, is one of these kinds of very like suitable projected song genre that can be heard over a large distance, which kind of suits again this kind of sonic and open space. Obviously not within the particular Gare setting, but the long songs, in particular the Uriangha long songs, are known to be quite special in a sense that not many people know about them so much. They're not really performed outside of these contexts. There are other types of long songs performed on a national scale in Mongolia, but these ones are slightly different in the way the melody works. But so this kind of long song, which is actually fits exactly what I was going to be talking about, because what you just heard then, for those of you that are musically inclined, is a form of heterophony. And so you have a melody that's flowing like this, and then someone kind of joining in, kind of think about like waves joining in other waves in the ocean, for instance. And so you kind of like someone joining in, but because the song is not metered, it hasn't got a beat behind it, it means that you're never going to be quite singing at exactly the same time. So it kind of creates a kind of atmosphere surrounding this, which is part of exactly what they're trying to do. They're not necessarily wanting, there's no way you could really sing a long song exactly the same time as anyone else unless you had metered it out, which kind of is it's almost like a different version of the genre, if you see what I mean. So this is a so heterophony is where you are trying to kind of follow someone's melody, and it's almost like playing a kind of game of darting and weaving amongst each other, or like you're following it, and then the skill in heterophony is to kind of create almost like a sonic echo to what's happening exactly the same time. And I make this kind of larger argument in my work of saying that this is happening not only between the melodies and between different singers, but also the way that it's working socially as well. So you kind of have a musical and a social heterophony. And I'll show you an example in a film example that I have. So this is Khövch. Oh, hang on, sorry. How did that not? Oh, that's funny. I might try and... Right. For some reason I've put this up and it hasn't changed the PowerPoint off. Let me try and just literally shut that down, and I'll have to open it up again, but I can manage that. So the man in the in the white hat with the blue headband is leading a song, and you'll see how different people take it up. And what you'll also see are the different types of preferred social actions. People greeting each other and asking them had they had a good journey. And you'll see that these kinds of social and musical elements interweave amongst each other, creating this type of celebration. And this type of celebration is called Bayat Sengel, and it's a real kind of cultivated attempt to try and bring together this kind of atmosphere that is not just musical, not just social, but a real mixture of the two. Okay. So that was a very classic example of Bayezengel, or celebration. And just to give you an idea of the level of scale we're talking about here, this wedding took, how long? Roughly about 8 hours. And by that point I'd been living there for a long time, and I had come back for another 6-month research period. And so my friend Sevigjov, who's pictured here with the glasses, was very keen for me to record this as part of this ongoing kind of documentation of their practice. And I recorded a sound segment of this, and for I think it was a 3-hour segment, there were 42 songs sung. So just to give you an idea that this is a really big thing to kind of to create. And someone described it to me as saying, well, I was asking, what is the role of Bayezengel? What's happening here? And they said, because we don't need a hard or closed off space. That's why when young people are singing, aged people are singing, when others are entering the ger, without near adornment, near decorations, which is what he's describing the songs as being, it will not be goy, which is meaning like beautiful and bright and shiny. So this kind of creation of the ongoing talking and singing is part of kind of creating this level of celebration. And this is directly related to bringing into being a kind of good future projection of the relationship between of the married couple's future life together, but also the relationship between these two families that are being joined together. So there's a lot at stake. You don't want to put on a bad nair to welcome a new person to an area. It's just not going to create a very good, setup for a number of reasons. It's going to have reverberating social effects, not only in the sense that people are going to be possibly would argue about it later in time to come, but also the fact that there are also kind of causal possible things that could go wrong and that could be attributed to something like that. So there is a lot at stake when someone is getting up and performing this, and there's a lot of pressure to get it right and to create it as much as possible. So sorry, that's my sound example again. I'm going to move on as a kind of another example in this talk. I'm now going to talk about a genre that is known as being definitely more of a spiritual connection to it. And this is the Altan Magtal, or the praise song to the Altai Mountains. This particular type of praise song has become quite emblematic as a very famous melody within Mongolia. It's a very beautiful melody. I'll show you another example. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. And what is it about is that it is a descriptive song that describes the beautiful landscape within the surrounding Altai Mountains. That's kind of like a very, crude summary of what it is, in terms of its content. It's quite a long, extended evocation. And the word Magtal is actually not a song. It means to praise. So people describe this as a praise, not rather than necessarily a singing a song. And I'm going to be talking today about a person called Damdandorj, who is a custodian of heroic epics from the area. So he is like a custodian and a knowledge bearer of a really significant spiritual genre of great importance. And as part of his kind of ongoing role, he also does different kinds of he's asked to do quite auspicious things, including in this particular instance, he's opening up a concert within the cultural centre, attended by all different people from the rural district and consisting of people performing different types of, songs, satirical songs, sometimes theatre, sometimes poetry, or sometimes waltzes played on a synthesizer where people dance towards the end of the concert. There's all these different kinds of things that can go on in the cultural centre, and he's being asked to open it. He himself is a custodian that comes from several generations, a long lineage of people practicing epics over a long period of time. And so he's one of the most important custodians in the area that I work in now. So I'm going to give play you a film excerpt of his performance. And it'll give you an idea of the other types of ways that these particular types of genres that have spiritual import are being performed in the cultural centre. Now, so hang on a minute, I've just got to, sorry. VLC won't allow me to have two files open at once, so I have to kind of do it bit by bit, unfortunately. Here we go. Sorry, just to give you a bit more background before I begin. To open this particular type of performance, Damdandorj gives a yerel, which is a type of blessing that he's blessing Dort and the people at this particular concert. And what I kind of want to demonstrate is a kind of loose comparison or correlation with the Nair behaviour of having quite important types of performative responsibilities, and also the kind of evocation of something happening good into the future through these types of actions. So he opens this particular performance with this blessing.
내 도토 장군님은 아직도 생들층 아롱으로 마스탕을 비추 순두두지 않고 도와주려 주시오되 아스타마스터 생기세요.
Yeah, I'll stop that there. But that was one refrain of this song genre, the Altan Magtal, of this particular song, sorry. And then Damdandorj would then repeat that particular refrain with a different different verse and kind of exegesis of the particular things. And in this particular performance, he's describing the different passages through the Altan Mountains, different kinds of weather events that can happen. It's kind of really delving in a descriptive way of what's happening in the surrounding landscape. Speaking with Damdandorj after this concert, I was asking him about the role of him performing Altan Magtal in a concert environment, because in some ways some people have seen this as a kind of secularization or a vestige of something that had happened previously during socialism, for instance. But the way he described it kind of showed different kinds of dimensions to it that move beyond, say, a kind of dichotomy between socialist performance practice and post-socialist, cultural rediscoveries. And he described to me, he said, singing the Altar Magtal is a way of wishing all of us, the public, to be free of sickness and suffering. Now when we worship the particular types of spiritual cans in the surrounding countryside in the summertime, the Altar Magtal will also be evoked there as well. In this, we hope we will be wishing to have more grass growth, have more rain, have the drought stopped, and the wider public to be free of sickness and suffering. These are the things I'll be thinking of while praying and praising our sky and the surrounding land deities and spirits when I praise the Altai. Some people in the audience will take and appreciate this, like Toj Awach is a way of saying it in Mongolian, to kind of take it in their own terms. Take this energy into their spirits by praying and thinking that their altar is being praised greatly. And some people will not necessarily be doing this, but that's an individual matter, he said. So it's kind of like just sort of, he understands very much that this is something that people will be taking seriously. Other people will be, interpreting this differently. And I sort of, after that, I drew a diagram of sort of thinking about how these things can be linked up. This is kind of an idealized version of this, and of course, these things happen in different ways and different types of instances, but here you can see the surrounding, this is being situated in the surrounding mountains. He's describing and praising the Altai. There's also the Altai represented on the back of the stage while he's performing, and the audience can kind of take this on as well if they want to sort of see it as a blessing for themselves. And then outside are in the surrounding mountains and pasture land, the spiritual deities or Luvsobdog are being praised as well. So it's kind of like an idealized picture of what he was attempting to do. So concerts in and of themselves were kind of taken, formed spaces where these particular kinds of evocations can happen. But what I want to emphasize, and I don't know if I will necessarily show any more examples of these kinds of things, but performing in different types of other ways was also a way to kind of evoke or to celebrate or to bring into being something extremely efficacious and beneficial. And this is a particular advertisement for a memorial concert, and they're describing Dort Lake as being similar to the ritual sprinkling of milk, which happens in the morning as a way of sprinkling milk to the sky and to bless the sky this way. And I think it presents an example of where performance and the cultivation of musical personhood is seen as so much as a kind of moral act as well, of kind of bringing into being something really important that can have a causal effect. Now, of course, this is kind of an idealized portrayal of this. Of course, within the rural district, there is, within any kind of, human social relationships, there's discord, there are disagreements, and I think also because the fact that a lot of these kinds of practices have such an important, role, is that the debate and the kind of delineation about particular types of genres and, which one's performing, who's performing it in the right way, and, how we can perform it, when we're going to do the next concert and how. These are kinds of things that people need to negotiate. But this part of this negotiation is a really important part of ongoing musical practice. And I just want to kind of emphasize how much people themselves at a young age are brought into these kinds of musical social worlds and encouraged to perform, including being encouraged to perform for visiting researchers as well, as a part of their upbringing. And as you can see in this particular photo here, these are Damnendorge's children who are also learning and playing this particular instrument, which is called the tovshor. And this particular version of the tovshor is very much the Uryanghai version. Again, this is kind of these links to something really particular, particularly Uryanghai. So to kind of wrap up and conclude and link this into more larger national debates or creations of, value, I guess what I wanted to kind of show through this description of this ethnography is just how much valuation or the significance placed on this as part of it being something quintessentially Mongolian also has a lot of import and value placed on it on a kind of minute day-to-day life part as well, where the carrying and the comportment of yourself in these ceremonial occasions, your presentation of self, and your larger moral personhood is sort of seen as something that is very much linked up to this kinds of musical practice, which are in turn also linked up to this valorisation of it on a national scale. And this kind of putting Dort on the map in this musical way is very significant for a number of reasons that I've explained, but also for the fact that Dort itself and West Mongolia economically isn't necessarily sitting in a large kind of resource place. There are several mines in the area that can generate some income, although that sort of stops and starts according to different kinds of economic and other types of cycles. But in terms of Dort itself, this is one of the major resources that it has, is this cultural resource, and I think that people cultivate that and protect it as such, and it's sort of some way we can think about resource and protection of that, and the creation of sovereignty, which has other themes that have extended out within recent work on Mongolia, part of the work that I've been doing here at UCL, which is linked up to resource extraction and the economy as well. I just wanted to highlight this particular picture. At the back of the stage behind this class portrait is two really important epic song custodians, which are and one of the people on the right is the descendant of the same people that Damdin Dorje is also descended from as well. So it's again this kind of locating these particular lineages in this area as being something incredibly important. And so I'll just finish with demonstrating just how much this is also linking up into national spheres as well. This is Bartajov, who's a renowned Uryanghai performer, Altai Uryanghai performer from Dort as well, who has made a living out of performance and promotion of Uryanghai culture in Ulaanbaatar, and he travels internationally on a regular basis as well. And this is an article on him in one of the daily newspapers in Ulaanbaatar called Unutr, which means today, and it's basically it's an interview with him about another song genre, which is the end-blown flute called the tsor. And in this particular article, it's kind of like the author is really evoking how much this is a kind of, the sound of his music is this kind of blast of fresh air, like a literal kind of like a synonymous blast of fresh air from the far off mountains in West Mongolia. And again, this kind of like essentializing of this place in West Mongolia as a kind of place of originalness, of authenticity, of a kind of wellspring of this kind of cultural practice. So I think I'll finish there, and I welcome any questions about it. Yeah, I think I'll do that.
Thanks so much.
All right, thanks.